There's a place in Gaylord, Michigan called Call of the Wild. There's a gift shop, a tiny bakery, and the entrance to the main attraction, the wildlife exhibit. In the wildlife exhibit, there's a door, right next to the woodchuck display, and beyond that door is something I never want to see again. I lived in northern Michigan for my entire childhood, only moving to the middle of the state for college. Gaylord was a weekly trip for my family, as it was the only place for miles at the time that had a Walmart. I've dealt with the woes one would expect from living so far north: poor internet, no good restaurants, and bitter, bitter cold. My concerns seem petty, but for a child growing up in the millennium, it was devastating to not be playing Neopets with the cool kids. But this isn't the time for nostalgia. It wasn't then either, when I first decided to revisit Call of the Wild. Why not, I had thought. I was visiting my parents for the weekend and had exhausted myself on rounds of Euchre and reruns of nightly comedy shows that they enjoyed watching. So when Sunday came around, I figured I'd get out on my own for a little excursion. It was snowing, so it was unlikely that my parents wanted to leave the house. They were just as equipped for cold conditions as I was. That is to say, not very. So I bundled up to my eyebrows before heading out. I'll spare you the details of my drive, which any Michigander will tell you varies based on your experience with driving in the snow. This is a very serious subject of debate. And simply say that I arrived at Call of the Wild with only one close brush with the curb. The parking lot was nearly empty, which wasn't at all unusual. As far as I knew, Call of the Wild only really attracted customers in the summer months when their mini golf and go-kart tracks were open. In the winter, people were regulated to the gift shop and the wildlife exhibit. When I say wildlife exhibit, I don't mean a zoo. I mean, I guess in a way it's a zoo. It had exhibits full of animals, but they're more of the stuffed and mounted variety. I remember it vaguely from my childhood as being a place I always wanted to go. I was obsessed with animals as a kid. To this day, I still never pass up the chance to visit a petting zoo. So to see their forms up close beyond a single wall of glass was the best chance I had to see things like foxes and otters. There were no real zoos in northern Michigan. When I walked in, the place was more or less what I remember. Woodland-themed decor, a strange and fascinating section of very expensive cowboy boots, stuffed bears, and wolves, and a bakery that had an odd selection of fudges. Cotton candy fudge, anyone? I steered clear of the strange chocolates and one very large family that couldn't decide whether they wanted to stand in the direct center of the store or not, and made my way to the wildlife exhibit counter. There was a fee to enter, so I began taking my wallet out of my pocket. As I reached the counter, I saw a yellow sheet of paper with clip art explosions on it, outlining in large black letters, "New exhibits coming soon." Now that was interesting. As far as I knew, Call of the Wild had never updated their exhibits. At least not in the 11 or so years I spent frequenting the place as a child. I asked the attendant, a girl with blue streaks in her brown ponytail, what those exhibits might be. "Oh, well, they're gonna be like about conservation and stuff," she said slowly. I don't know really. Hunters and stuff?" Call of the Wild had always been pretty strongly aimed towards conservation of animal habitats and populations. There was always one or two exhibits that discussed the rarity of certain birds, or how increased human populations have driven back certain species from their home. Nothing about climate change. That was a little too progressive of an agenda for this part of the state, but I wondered that this new exhibit wasn't a soft push for change in that area. Either way, I paid the toll and walked inside. The exhibit is incredibly dark with lighted sconces along the floor that lead you through a track of poorly lit dioramas. The animals, frozen in time, look almost intimidating when lit from the bottom, and things like horns and wings map out tall, arcing shadows on the backdrops. The artwork is impressive, in all honesty, and I took a few moments at each exhibit to appreciate the intricacy of painted mountains and forest. The taxidermied animals were impressive too, so much that child me believed they were the real thing, a fully authentic animal rather than skin and fur stretched over mounts. I wasn't very educated on the process of decomposition for a few years. I savored the visit, as I was the only person wandering through. So many of the displays reminded me of my youth spent here, at least twice a month for years, and it was nice to see they'd held up artistry that I remember them being. However, there was one thing I noticed that I don't remember seeing before. Between the exhibit on woodchucks and beavers, two very different animals, as the exhibits explain, there was a door. It was nondescript, so mundane that it could have been easily passed over by the eye if you weren't looking for it. However, this door, painted as black as the walls of the corridors, was cracked open just enough to let a small ray of natural light through. It could have been that I had never noticed a door before, being that it was the same color as everything, but I'm sure I would have remembered the unusual amount of space between the two exhibits and discovered something to be there. I began to walk away from it, but something in the back of my head dared me to peek inside. "You're the only one here," it whispered. "Why not? Maybe it was an area behind the scenes. Maybe you could see the inner workings behind the magic of the carefully crafted displays." I hesitated for a moment. "I don't know," said the rational part of my brain. "What if someone was back there? I can't imagine they'd be too thrilled to see some random guy popping in. What if it's where they keep supplies for the gift shop? They might think I'm stealing." I pocketed the thought for the time being and kept going through the exhibit. At the end of the displays, there was a new section. It was fully built out with a painted backdrop and a foreground of fake rocks and flora, but was missing the info card in front, as well as any taxidermy figures, that is. Except one. A man in orange hunting gear stood in the center of the exhibit. I jumped at first until I realized he wasn't real. Frozen with a rifle pointed up into a random location on the ceiling, the man was the most perfect human figurine I had seen since that one famous wax museum. His eyes seemed to line up perfectly with the scope, and his facial expression was one of those stolid concentration. I marveled at the realistic skin, one that bore the lightest cover of facial hair stubble and lips that appeared chapped, even from here. More than any of their other animal figures, this one was the real thing. The fingers that gripped the rifle pleated and pinched exactly like real skin would, and the fingernails had such varied appearances that they could have passed for a man's actual hands. Whoever did this had an eye for realism. I stared at the figure for what felt like 10 minutes, imagining what the rest of this exhibit would look like. Something about poaching or overhunting maybe, since this was a conservationist piece. I had the chance to leave. The exit was right there, and I could have simply looped back around to the other side of the gift shop and have been done with it. I could have went home, maybe with a novelty teddy bear to take back to my dorm room, and let Call of the Wild be a sweet reminder of my childhood. Instead, I turned back around to the door. I was compelled by something, whether it was curiosity or a selfish need to be in a place where one was not invited. The new exhibit had me intrigued. What could I find back there? Could I see what the rest of the exhibit is shaping up to be? Would there be more brilliant pieces of art like the man in the hunting gear? The door remained partially open as I had left it, and after a moment of hesitation, I slowly pulled it open. The room beyond came into view, and the first thing I saw was boxes. Lots of boxes. I felt a little disappointed that this room may have been just a storage area for the gift shop like I had thought. But the further I opened the door, the more I saw. A taxidermy duck stood atop a box, and behind it, I could see the shadows of antlers pointed in an odd direction at the ceiling. The room, with white walls and a bare cement floor, was larger than I could have imagined. It was well lit with light streaming in from windows as I couldn't yet see, and my fear of being spotted went away. If it was more of an intimate space, I may have felt a little strange being there. But with it being more like a warehouse and less like a closet, I felt confident there, almost like being in a Home Depot or something. I took a few steps in and realized that this is what I hoped it was, a taxidermy storage for the exhibits. The antlers belonged to a bundled group of deer mounts in one corner, strewn together like jacks. In another area, I could see standing beaver mounts, their bristly heads poking up over closed boxes of what I imagined were tools. As I rounded the initial curve of stacked boxes, I became aware of a strange smell. It was a sharp, chemical smell, like one you'd find in a hardware store. I almost coughed as it caught me off guard, but I stopped myself when I noticed the boxes were leaking. Blood. Red blood pooled around a drain in the floor, practically radiating with light against the dull white cement. I felt myself grow weak suddenly, as if a lightning bolt had ripped through the top of my head to my feet. I was never very good with blood, and seeing so much of it made me immediately nauseous. My head spun with questions as I continued walking, despite everything in my body telling me to run to see where it all flowed from. Around the corner there was a table. I let out a whoosh of relief. On the table lay a handful of taxidermy models, and most notably, a lump of fur that I imagined belonged to an animal. Blood seeped from beneath the clump of hair and across the metal table. And it clicked at once. This is where they performed the taxidermy. It didn't hit me then, like it does now, that taxidermied animals must have their skins cured before being mounted, and that it was unlikely for them to be butchered at the same places they were to be worked on. At the time, I just assumed that the blood was from a fresh, soon-to-be taxidermied creature. That would explain the strange smell, I thought. Chemicals for preserving the flesh of the animal, or so I had thought anyway. To this day, I still can't explain the smell. More of the table came into view, and I stopped suddenly and ducked behind a pile of boxes when I realized I wasn't alone. At the end of the table was a man at a stool, bent over with his back to me. He must not have heard me, I deduced, looking over the edge of the box. He wore faded overalls and a red shirt with the sleeves rolled up. And, judging by his balding gray head, I assumed he was probably in his 60s or 70s. He was bent over a taxidermy mount with a handful of small silver objects that he pressed into a mount at seemingly random points. I couldn't quite tell what kind of animal it was. The fur at the end of the table didn't give me any clues. Besides that, it was something that had fur, and I was curious to get a closer look. There wasn't a lot of space between the man and I, and what lay between us was a pool of blood. I stared at the floor, and then at the man, and nearly turned around and left. I should have just turned around and left. Instead, I braved the blood and stepped closer. I was wearing black boots anyway, and it was sure to wash off in the snow outside, so I wasn't worried about ruining my shoes. I just had to get a closer look. I took another step, careful not to let my boots squeak on the floor, and ignored the rising bile in my throat that despised the blood beneath my feet. The man's hands were slow and deliberate as they worked. Soon, I could see the mount. It was a face. The face squinted as if it was in pain. One eye scrunched up tight and the other one wildly open, but the sockets were empty. The mouth was screwed into a tight grimace. I could have screamed, but with my already weak body trying to maintain its composure through the blood and the sneaking around, I hadn't much air in my lungs to begin with. I stared at the face, feeling the blood leave my own, and watched as the old man continued to manipulate the flesh and place silver objects. He was pinning it. He was pinning the skin to the mount. I could have vomited, but something in the back of my head spoke to me. It wasn't real, was it? It couldn't be. Maybe it was latex, maybe it wasn't skin. My mind was in a frenzy, torn between fear and fact, fiction and relief. There could be an explanation that didn't involve human skin. I believed that until I noticed a slumped figure beyond the table. A man lay against the far wall. He wore green camouflage like you would see on a hunter. His boots were turned at odds, so his legs were splayed open as though he was relaxing. His hands lay close to his sides, palms upward, and covered in black winter gloves. I wish he had a face underneath that hat. That's the image that haunts me the most. My scream couldn't be repressed this time as I stared at the fresh red skull, stained yellow and white, coated in strands of flesh that had been carelessly left behind. The teeth without lips appeared clenched together as a bare jaw rests sideways against the chest. Lidless eyes stared at random points on the floor. as bright as the bulbs of some underground seedling, pale, lifeless. The man at the table turned around and our eyes met. He wore a thick pair of glasses, one that obscured the true size of his eyes, making them appear tiny and vole-like. In his other hand, previously unseen, he clenched a bit of hair-coated flesh, the same hair that laid on the opposite side of the table. I recognized it suddenly. Before the man could say anything, I booked it. I ran as fast as I remember running in my life. My lungs burned from the anxious breathing I'd been doing, struggling to take in a full breath. I burst out the end of the exhibit like one might imagine a rampaging livestock would do. Blind, clumsy. I stumbled into a rotating display of name keychains and stickers in the shape of the state, knocking it onto the table of sweaters nearby. I don't know if the attendant said anything to me. I couldn't hear anything above the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. I raced to my car, slipped along the ice, and slammed the door as I got inside. As I grabbed my phone from my pocket to call the police, the man from the room appeared at the front door. He peered out for a moment, and I ducked down into my seat. As he began to open the door, I realized with a sick feeling that the snow in front of him was laced with footprints left in blood that led straight to my car. He noticed this at the same time I did, and I swear he looked right at me as I started my engine and began to reverse out of the parking lot. He didn't yell or raise his arms. He simply stood there as I drove as fast as I could out onto the road. I barely missed sideswiping another vehicle as I slid out into the snow, my tires squealing and my brakes clunking. The last look I gave Call of the Wild, I could see the man receding back into the building. Now, I should have called the cops. It had been 2 hours since I arrived home with tears in my eyes, and that I couldn't explain to my parents. They wouldn't believe me, would they? They didn't believe me when I said that the red footprints leading to my window weren't left by me on my way into the house.